Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today we're quilting block number 3, our Patchwork Tulip, and we're going to cover it with many beautiful designs. We're going to use some swirling water in the background, beautiful feathers in the flower, and a combination of free motion pebbles and ruler foot quilting straight lines in the vase. So let's get on the machine and learn how to quilt all of these designs step by step. So we're ready to quilt block number 3, and I have already stitched it in the ditch to secure it. So I've stitched around the flower, the stem, vase, and between the center block and the border. And then I have also marked the block. I marked the background with a water-soluble blue pen. I've marked a little bit of the pebbling here in the vase. And I have marked the feathers here. And this diagram you can find in the pattern. I just printed this out onto freezer paper and I stitched it down to the surface of the quilt with water-soluble thread. So I'll be able to stitch over it, then rip that away to reveal our quilting. So I'm just going to get started stitching right on that center line. And there's a lot of seam allowances right on those corners, so just be careful and mindful of that as you're getting started. If your foot feels kind of bound up a little bit, that's normal. You might have to give it a little extra push to get going. So now I'm carefully stitching on this line, and I am going to rotate this around and be shifting it just simply because that feels good for me today. Might not be something that feels good for you, so just see what feels good and helps you flow through the stem and stay on the line. You know, we want a nice smooth curve for this first starting line. So I'm going to make my way up to this corner. And again, there's just a little extra seam allowance in those corners because they're half square triangles. So as you get close to it, go on ahead and expect that and slow down a little bit and control your hands, because those extra layers of fabric underneath the quilt can sometimes bind up your foot and just slow everything down. So now I've changed direction. I'm working my way back. It's okay to fold up the quilt. You know, never hesitate to get your block, fold it up, roll it up, whatever you need to do in order to make it manageable to quilt through your home machine. So now I'm stitching back, and this is almost an echo. I'm going to speed up just a bit. My stitches are looking a little chunky to me. This is something about free motion quilting is, of course you can always vary the size of your stitches simply by putting your foot down and speeding up the machine a little bit, but keeping your hands the same speed, the same movement of your hands. Also stitching a little bit off the line, but I'm doing it consistently, so I guess that's okay. If you consistently miss a mark or consistently miss a line, then it looks like you mean to do it. It's not an accident. Okay, there we go. That's our stem stitched. And now I'm going to stitch back along that and branch out from my feather. I'm going to come back up. This is a travel back feather, and swing out for the next feather. And I'm just connecting with that center line that I've already stitched, that vein line. And so that's how I'm going to stitch all of these feathers, just traveling back, swinging out, forming that shape. There are many other ways that you can quilt feathers. Definitely watch the video on the feather wreath. That's quilting block number 1. And you can see a couple other methods of quilting feathers you might want to try. It's a very, very simple set of shapes. It's basically kind of a curvy teardrop, but it's one of those ones that takes a little extra practice. It took me a few months to really be able to do this properly without making the feathers look really weird and clunky. And the key for me was just figuring out the method, the pattern, and path to stitch that felt the most natural. And that's going to be different for everybody. So really be patient with yourself. Give yourself permission to try a lot of different angles, a lot of different directions. And especially as these feathers get bigger, just watch out for that. Maybe spread out your hands just a little bit on the quilt surface so that way you can stitch from the beginning all the way through that curve without having to stop. When you stop in the middle of a feather, that's when you can get kind of a little wobble or a little blip in that smooth line. So just watch out for that. So I'm just going to keep quilting along all of these lines, and then I'll probably stitch back over them a second time because I really like to make the feathers nice and dark. It also makes the paper that much easier to tear away. So I've finished my feathers, and now I've moved to the stem area of this block, and I'm just filling in the skinny green stem with a flowing line. I kind of wiggle my way up, come to a point, and then wiggle my way back. And I did mark this, but it's not marked exactly the same way that it was marked in the pattern. It's one of those things that you could definitely stitch freehand. You don't need marks to guide you. It's a very, very simple design here. I'm just stitching up, kind of curving in, and then hitting that point. There is a lot of seam allowance in this area, so just go slow, be careful. If you feel your foot get hung up, slow your hands down and push a little bit more firmly against the quilt, and that will definitely help. So we're going to go straight from the stem and into a design called Swirling Water, and I have marked it on the quilt. I'm going to get started on this side, swirling into this shape. So I'm going to travel stitch over, and here's how this design works. We're going to stitch inside with that big open spiral. That's the first step of the design. And I marked it, but I really want you to try and stitch it kind of according to the rules, so that way it can really get logged into your hands, logged into your memory, and then you'll be able to stitch it anywhere on your quilts. So an open spiral is a spiral where you leave space for yourself to get back out. So I stitched inside, and then I'm essentially echoing that first line all the way back. There we go. Now I'm going to do a good bit of travel stitching. I have a choice to go for either side. I'm going to travel stitch over here because the next step of the design is simply to echo it. I'm going to travel stitch over and echo, but kind of swirl inside and connect with our spiral shape. That's how we get this really beautiful swirling effect. So I'm going to branch out, stitch inside, connect with the tip of that spiral, and then I'm going to swing out and I'm going to echo around the opposite way. So here I'm going all the way around the back side of that spiral. And as you're stitching something, kind of big in a big shape movement, just watch the placement of your hands. See how wide my hands are apart. That way I can make this movement without having to stop in the middle of that curve where I could get could kind of wobble or wiggle around. Let me just show you what I mean. If I have to stop and kind of shift things around or move my hands around, well, when I get started again, it's a good chance that I might kind of wiggle just a bit as I'm getting started. It takes practice. You can definitely get to the point where you can make seamless stops and starts, but it's one of those things that you might want to just put your hands wider, then you don't have to stop and start at all. Now I'm going to travel stitch down. I've got a few little spaces in here, a few little lines. I'm going to hit those. Just travel stitch over, stitch in, connect, and then stitch back out again. So that's how you stitch a swirling water shape. And you can see we're going to have some odd areas in here where part of the shape is going to get cut off and that kind of thing. The best thing to do is just try stitching on the lines that you've marked, and that's going to be a good guide just to get started. And then continue practicing the design. There is a worksheet included in the pattern so that you can continue practicing and playing with it, and then try quilting it freehand once you get the hang of it. It's such a fun design to stitch, and it has such a gorgeous texture. So now I'm quilting in the vase area, and this is kind of a two-part design. We're going to be filling in the bottom of the vase with pebbling, and then we're going to fill in the top of the vase with straight line quilting. I'm going to do that with ruler foot quilting. You could also do that with your normal free motion quilting foot. You could also do that with your walking foot. And just like before, we learned pebbling in the last block, I'm going to fill in these little spaces between the pebbles with just a little thread, just stitching back and forth over and over to fill in all those gaps. I'm also going to stitch over my pebbles once or twice. So I'm going to stitch them and then I'm going to travel stitch around them. And in doing this, this is going to really make them stand out nicely. I really want these pebbles to be very bold on the quilt surface, and by adding more thread, I'm going to do exactly that. Now, it's a little faint, but I have a straight line here across the bottom of the vase, and I want to go on ahead and stitch that. I want to have that base, that straight line across to be stitched, so that way I don't accidentally overshoot it or forget about it. It's real easy to do, and I really wanted that line to be in there and established. So now let's talk through some of this pebbling. We've got a lot of half circle, quarter circle shapes. So I'm just going to stitch these as they stack together. I have marked this, but of course you could definitely quilt this freehand. And I'm just going to get the basic outlines of the shapes, and then after I get them set up and established, I'm going to quilt back over them a few times. And this is definitely something extra. You don't have to do it. It's me kind of geeking out on my love of thread a little bit, I'll admit. But it's one of those things that I think is going to make that vase really stand out beautifully. It's going to make this design really pop. It's absolutely not required, but I think it adds that little extra texture that makes your quilt really special. So you can see I've stitched around those circles, and then I've just gone back and forth, just adding a little bit of extra thread around each circular shape. The second half of the vase design involves straight line quilting. We're going to stitch straight lines from the top of the vase down to our pebbling, travel stitch along the top of the pebbling, and stitch a straight line back up. Now I am doing this with ruler foot quilting, so I have my ruler foot on my machine, and I'm using template number 3 from the Dresden Plate template set, and that's going to guide me. So I'm pressing down on the ruler, I'm pressing that against the ruler foot. Now, when I'm travel stitching against something weird, I found that if I have the ruler, that can sometimes throw me off. So I'm going to set that aside as I travel stitch over. And I'm travel stitching over until visually the edge of this foot is lined up with the line I just stitched. So that looks good. I'm going to grab my ruler once again, and I'm going to line up the edge of that ruler with the line I just stitched as I stitch straight back. Now I'm going to travel stitch over, and you could take the ruler and use it as a guide to help you with that straight line travel stitching. And again, I'm just stitching over until the edge of the ruler foot is in line with the edge of the line I just stitched. Might need to nudge it over one more stitch. That looks good. And then now I'll stitch straight down. So it's super, super simple quilting. You could also do this with normal free motion quilting. You could also do this with your walking foot. It's entirely up to you. I love the challenge of combining ruler foot quilting and travel stitching against the pebbling design in the bottom. I kind of have to, it makes me really have to think and focus on that. I have to really maintain concentration, because what's really easy to do is to get down here in the pebbling and then just stitch a straight line across, which is not really what I want to do here. You know, I really want it to just travel stitch along those circular shapes, add more thread there, and then make it look seamless as we go from one side to the other. So I think that looks great. I love the effect. Here's what it looks like whenever I finished quilting the vase with ruler foot quilting. We have some more straight lines that we can quilt with our ruler foot, and that is the inner outline between the block and the border. And honestly, if I could go back and change something, I probably would have stitched this line with my walking foot whenever I was doing my stitching in the ditch. Whenever I secured the block at the beginning, I would have gone on ahead and stitched in the ditch in this line between the blocks and the border, and I would also have stitched along that line that's about 1/8 of an inch inside the block. It's just one of those things, you know, I thought that this would be a good time to do it with my ruler foot attached, but I really kind of wanted that done beforehand. It's okay, don't get obsessive about the order that things go in. It's working out just fine, and it's another opportunity to play around with ruler foot quilting. So here I'm lining up the edge of my template with the edge of that ruler foot, and I'm kind of having to eyeball it because you can see I don't have any lines over here to really line up with, or over on this side either. I'm just kind of having to eyeball 1/4 of an inch, and then also watch my needle to make sure that it's not veering
wildly away from that line. I'm trying to keep it nice and straight and use that template as a guide. So this is one of those things that can be a little confusing in quilting as far as the order that you do things. I don't think there's a right or wrong time to stitch anything, but I did find when I was quilting the swirling water in the background that I really wanted to already have that outline stitched. So action learning tip, maybe when you're quilting your block, go on ahead and stitch the straight line of quilting along with your ditching at the same time at the beginning of the block. I think it'll work out much better that way. The last step of the block is always to quilt this echo shell border, or little rainbows. I always remember that. Jen from the Facebook group said that she thinks of them as little rainbows, and it always makes me laugh. So you quilt along the outer ring first, and then you're going to travel stitch inside and stitch along that inner line and travel stitch again. Just keep quilting each of these rings. You could also do it the opposite way. You could stitch from the inner rings to the outer rings too. It really doesn't matter. Just as you can see, whenever I get into that ditch and do that travel stitching, I really slow down so that way I stay right in the ditch and I don't hop out. So now I'm going to stitch the spiral circle in the corner. So you first stitch the circular shape. Whoops, and I kind of wung out because that little bit of fluff was distracting me. But that's okay. It happens to everybody. So I'm going to also wing out my spiral a little bit here so that way it looks consistent. You know, little mistakes like that happen, no big deal. I'm going to stitch to the inside and then travel stitch all the way back out again. It's a very, very simple design. You know, marks can sometimes just be suggestions. You know, they don't always have to be something that you stitch exactly. And if you really get obsessive about it, like I did a little bit of bad travel stitching there, you can always throw more thread at it. Don't rip it out, just throw more thread at it and move on with the design. So I'm going to hop around this border, filling it in with echo shell. And here's what it looks like whenever we finished quilting block number 3.
So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning more about these beautiful designs. If you have any questions about this quilting process, please ask in the comments below. I'm here to help you learn more about machine quilting. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. That really helps me out a lot. Until next time, let's go quilt.